Hi, my name is Cynthia Murray, or Cindy. I'm a retired Army nurse presently living in El Paso, Texas. I grew up in Minnesota. I was the middle child of 5. My mom was a nurse. My dad was a printer. And it was a great childhood for me. My mom was a great influence, and when I decided that I wanted to be a nurse because of her, I ended up going to the Swedish hospital in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And while I was there, developed friendships, and I had a friend in my senior year. It was a 3-year program. A friend in my senior year who came to my room the night before we left for Christmas break, and she told me she was going to join the Army. And I just looked at her and said, well, maybe I should do that with you. She says, oh, wait a minute. And she runs back to her room and comes back, and she says, look, I've got 2 of everything. It's an omen. And I did not have a boyfriend. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do when I graduated, and I thought, why not? It was a 2-year obligation. The Army would pay for us as PFCs, I think, or privates, for the last 5 months, 6 months of our school, and then we had that 2-year obligation. I went home, talked to my mom and dad, told them what I wanted to do, and I told them, I says, I know who I am, and I know that women in the military do not always have a good reputation, but I do know who I am, and I'm okay with that. I want to do that. They both agreed, but the only thing my dad said is, why don't you want to go in the Navy? He was in the Navy in World War II. I said, Dad, I'd rather go with somebody I know than just go. So I joined the Navy, or the Army, the Army with Mary. We graduated, passed our state boards, and went to basic training in San Antonio in September of 1969. Following that, we came to El Paso after our basic class to learn how to be operating room nurses. And at that time, I fell in love with one of our techs and got married. So Mary and I were not going to be staying together. She wanted definitely to go to Vietnam. That was her passion. After we finished the course, I ended up going to San Antonio to Brooke Army Medical Center. And my husband still had about 6 months before he would be able to get out of service and stayed in El Paso. I loved San Antonio, and when my husband came, on our first wedding anniversary, he looked at me and said, I don't love you anymore, and he left. I was devastated. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and my 2-year obligation was almost over with, and I said, I'm going to put in my paperwork for vol and def to see if I could stay in a little bit longer. And if they let me stay in, I said I would like to go to either Vietnam or Japan. I had an older sister whose husband was stationed there. And they came back and said, you're approved to stay in, and yes, you're going to Vietnam. To get on the plane to go to Vietnam. We had families. They stopped in Hawaii. And then I believe they stopped in Okinawa to let off families. And that's where I changed from my Class B uniform into my BDUs, combat boots. I felt it would be better to be dressed appropriately once I got to Vietnam. We got there like at midnight. And it was really interesting. They sprayed around the doors of the airplane before they opened the doors. And I said, I've never seen that before, but once they opened the doors, it was to keep bugs out, but it didn't keep the smell. There's a definite smell in Vietnam with all the moisture in the rivers and people's habits. We went to a hangar, all of us, and I was the only woman. The part that really struck me was I was the only lady who got off of the airplane and stayed. Everybody else left. Once they did some briefing with us, we got on Army school buses, that's what I called them, And the driver told me, I was sitting right behind him, he said, if you hear any gunshots, just get down on the floor. It was after midnight. Driving, there was a Jeep in front of our bus with a soldier on it with a machine gun going back and forth until we got to our base for the night. You didn't see any people. There were no lights on in any buildings, no animals, nothing. It was just us on the road. Once I got to the replacement company, there was only one other lady who was asleep, and I'm in my BDUs, and I was thinking, I didn't know what was outside the doors of the building I was in. And I thought, do I change into my pajamas or do I stay in my BDUs? And I finally said, God's in control, and I changed into my pajamas. That morning, when I got up, looking out the back door where I was sleeping, it was like a big backyard, and then there was wire fences on the at the end of the yard, and it was the road, and there were tons of people and the traffic going back and forth. So I was, I was kind of surprised. I said, oh, that's kind of close to all these people. I don't know them. But I was lucky I did not have to stay at the replacement company more than that one night, because I was assigned to the 24th Evac Hospital in Long Bend, and that was just fairly close to where I was at. So I got transferred over to my hospital. I was an operating room nurse, and the hospital was built with Quonset huts, and we had 2 Quonset huts for the OR, and there were 3 rooms in each of the operating rooms. It wasn't like they had walls. They had the 3 beds, and then they had like a big giant room divider between each of the ORs. And the first time I went in, when they had casualties, they said, just stand against the wall and watch. And I felt like a fly. It was really kind of strange, but it was just amazing to watch the teamwork and how our nurses and techs and doctors took care of these patients. They would bring in one of the soldiers, and he would go to the farthest room back. They had an operating scrub nurse and an RN with anesthesia. There was also another nurse or tech as a floater that would help them get started on that patient. And once they had the drapes on and things were going, they already had the next patient in the next little cubicle. You could hear people in the 3 ORs talking, the noises, but the teamwork was just fantastic to watch. I was in Vietnam. I got there the 10th of October 1971 and left the 10th of October 1972, maybe half an hour early. But I was stationed at 2 different places. Initial assignment was at the 24th Evac Hospital, and we had troops. We did see soldiers come in. Our operating room initially had 6 ORs, and we basically only used 3, and occasionally a 4th one if we needed it, but that was very, very rare. We didn't have casualties like they did earlier in Vietnam, where if you read a lot of books that people write about having casualties, 72 hours, working until you almost dropped, as he said, a lot of blood and injuries to people that just a lot of heartache and a lot of hard times for people. Where I was at, we would get some of the soldiers that had gunshot wounds, shrapnel. Not a lot of them. Mostly it would be limbs that there were problems with. We had full services. We did neurosurgery, maxillofacial injuries. We did have quite a few of those. ENT, general surgery. But that was pretty much it. Sometimes I have to look back on my experience and I feel a little bit guilty because of all the experiences earlier in Vietnam that other nurses had, but I know I made a difference. One of the things that I learned in the operating room, I felt that I really learned how to be compassionate for our soldiers coming in. These are young soldiers that came in that would maybe not know if they with surgery, if they would, what they would wake up with or without. And I always made sure I had a hand on their shoulder or held their hand while they were going to sleep. I would whisper in their ears that I was going to take care of them while they were in surgery. I always made sure I had eye makeup on, eye color and mascara, because I wanted them to see me and know that I was an American woman taking care of them. Just maybe to give them a little bit more comfort. Casualties, if we had 8 or 10 patients, that was a casualty service for us. Nighttime, initially I had a really hard time going to sleep at night, even if all our work was done. Usually in the middle of the night there would be helicopters that I could hear coming in to the hospital. And I'd wake up, or if I wasn't asleep, I was already there, and I was thinking, oh, we're going to get casualties, and nobody ever came. And I finally realized, or was determined, that these were helicopters coming in to pick up patients to be evacuated to Japan or to medical ships so that they could be taken back to more definitive care going home. So it was interesting. The people I worked with was great. I mean, anesthesia. Most of the doctors, we used to have one doctor that used to always raid our refrigerator. We took care of him one day. And our techs, everybody worked hard. We had a movie theater outside that they showed a lot of movies. They had a beautiful chapel. The cooks for holidays served wonderful meals for us for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Christmas was special. Our nursing staff did Christmas carols around the wards. But it was fun. You made friendships and you were able to do things. I was able to go out to one of the troop clinics, and you could see out there on the drive out in the big deuce-and-a-half truck, you could see the trees that were bare of any foliage, and you knew that they had been sprayed. Soldiers out there, they were always happy to see the medical people. And of course they were always happy. I never had to walk if I didn't want to. One time, a young man, I was invited to go out to an engineering company, and they had built a go-kart racetrack in Long Bend. And they wanted me to come out and watch the races. And there was one guy, I mean, he must have been 6'2", he was a big guy, and he wanted a picture so he could send it home to his mom. So I did. I let him put his arm around me, and I hope his mom wasn't too upset. But those were the kind of things that you did. And as I said, you didn't have to walk any place if you didn't want to. We occasionally had nurses that were invited to dinners at various locations with generals, and I think that was just nice to be able to have some round. They used to call us round eyes. That was their big thing. They were everybody was appreciative of that. But after, I'm rambling on. But after I was at Long Bend for 7 months, the war was winding down. This was in '72, May of '72. I was told I was going to be reassigned to the 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon. I had to wear a white uniform and a nurse's cap for duty. No more BDUs. And there we didn't do a lot of surgeries. We would do some emergencies, car accidents, appendectomies. We did do a couple C-sections. But it was and some orthopedics that maybe from injuries soldiers got from sports or whatever. But it was a very busy city. The hospital was like in a compound in the city. It had a wall around it. The dormitories for us, the barracks, were across the street. if you went at night, there were guards that would be able to watch you walk between your dormitory and the hospital. And but otherwise, we didn't have a lot of casualties. It got to be, there were times when in Saigon we could hear or feel the earth shaking from bombing of the B-52s up in North Vietnam. And that was the first time I ever realized that. That was, I mean, I didn't know what it was, and then it finally dawned on me, talking with some other people, that's what.
So I'm Jeff Swanson, and I served in the Marine Corps in Vietnam in Marine Corps helicopters and did medevacs, and I also served in the trauma hospital in Iraq during the surge, but later as a military chaplain. But Cindy, I'd just like to ask you a question. When you were at Long Binh and these young people would come in so terribly hurt, they're young, they're healthy, everything is just going on well in their lives, they're strong, things are peachy keen, except they've got a bullet wound, their faces, ripped apart by shrapnel, they've got concussion wounds, they're bleeding. I mean, and you provided this intimate care for them. How did you get through that without yourself getting depressed or turning to strong drink or smoking yourself to death or doing other things that are so self-destructive? How did you get through that? What are your resiliency factors?
I look at that initially. One of the reasons why I wanted to go to Vietnam was I knew there were young men there that were getting shot up, getting injured, and that they deserved the best care they could get. And I wanted to do that. I wanted to be a part of that. I think with what's going on, I mean, losing a leg or an arm, some of the really bad injuries that we had, of course, we had people that didn't make it through the operating room. But I think because of the reason why I wanted to go over there was to take care of these people, I concentrated more on them in the operating room. And I also had good friends that we could talk things through if we needed to. But, it really, I was there to give them the care, and that's what I was concentrating on. And unfortunately, if somebody lost a limb or they were really, really sick, there was only one young man that really got to me. And one of the things that we learned, that our medical people learned in Vietnam is that, there were two things that I know that they learned. One, anybody that comes into the operating room with any kind of an abdominal wound, even if there is like a piece of shrapnel someplace, you don't just put a finger up the hole to see if it goes through to the intestinal system. And they would automatically do an exploratory lap and what we call run the bowel, look at the whole bowel to make sure that there were no holes in it, because if there is, that means that there's poop going inside that person. They get an infection and sometimes they die, probably more than that. And there was one young man that they didn't do what they should have done, and they did. That young man had a horrendous femoral fracture, and he got infected, and he didn't make it. And really, this is the one thing that always, this is probably the hardest thing that I saw. I can remember seeing that surgeon, not the one that found the hole, that had to take that guy. I can remember at night seeing him sitting by that patient's bedside with his head down. And I think that, to me, that was the hardest thing, because something that could have been done didn't get done. Otherwise, I felt like we were there to provide for them. And almost 40 years as an operating room nurse, I think that's what I was there for. The blood and all that stuff doesn't bother me. I'm there. I've got a job to do. And I want to do it the best that I can. I wanted to be prepared. I wanted to make sure that we were giving the best care possible, whether it was in war or it's a weekend call in an operating room and you have to do patients. And I think, I don't look back at that and think about that, because I did that. I mean, I've done a lot of those things in my regular operating rooms here in the States. I was there to give the best care possible, and I think that's what talking about, I think that's really the way I looked at it. Not expecting, oh, I'm going to get a lot of blood and guts, not looking at it from that standpoint of view. I think that's, for me, I guess, part of being compassionate too, and maybe a self preservation. As I said, I don't remember any names of the people that I took care of in my operating room. Those that may not have made it, their pictures on the wall. My husband was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and I remember with him, I probably had been to the wall 3 times, and every time I go, we lived in Maryland, so we were close, and I would ask him if he wanted to go, and he always said no. And we did a vacation one year where we stopped and stayed with friends along the way, and we stopped in D.C., and I wanted to go see the Vietnam Women's Memorial. And I asked Johnny if he was ready for the wall, and he said yes. My heart just flipped. I would say flipped would be better than flopped. And he went, and he looked, and he found friends. He had a friend from high school, and as a helicopter pilot over there, he lost a lot of friends. And he looked up everybody that he could, and as we were leaving, he said, oh, wait a minute, I remembered another person. And went back to look. I just felt like that was a healing experience for him. I don't know if a lot of people know or not, but as a helicopter pilot at Fort Rucker, Alabama, they have a room of remembrance of every pilot that died in Vietnam. The room is all white, and there's a statue of a pilot, all white. And my husband went in that with another friend of his that had been in Vietnam. And Anita and I just left them to be, because they were doing a lot of closure and of looking at names of their friends that died in Vietnam.